Okay, so this is going to be the completion of our respiratory chapter. The first time that we met, we went over more of the anatomy side of things. So we focused on the structure, all of the different parts that were involved with the respiratory system. And now for the second conversation, we're going to change over and look more at the physiology side of things. So how does the respiratory system have to function in order to fully carry out the job that it is supposed to take care of? So you should be looking at your second packet. We did not touch on this one at all when we met, and it should say gas exchange at the very top. So when we look at the process of gas exchange, we're talking about two things happening. We can't just focus on getting oxygen in, and that's kind of where everybody wants to go. But getting oxygen in, as important as it is only half of the story. You also have to make sure that you're getting carbon dioxide out. So the exchange of gas across a cell membrane is going to move in both directions to make sure that the entire or full process of the respiratory system is being carried out. When we talk about gas exchange, I mentioned the other day that that process is going to happen at the alveoli. So air is going to transfer from the nose and mouth all the way through the respiratory tract until it gets down to the alveoli. And then the thin wall of the alveoli, as well as the thin wall of the capillaries that run right next to them, allows for those gases to be able to easily pass through the cell membranes and get from one location to the next. Now, this is going to be carried out by the process of diffusion. And diffusion goes back to when we started talking about cells, because one of the concepts that we talked about when we talked about cells was the movement of material across the cell membrane. And we talked about the different ways that that happens. And if you remember with diffusion, diffusion is going to fall into the category of being passive transport. And what that means is you can move material across the cell membrane, but it doesn't require energy in order to happen. And the bigger picture of that, the reason that that is so important is because of the fact that we're trillions of cells in size. And if moving oxygen and carbon dioxide across the cell membrane required energy, and you had to do that trillions of times over all day, every day, there is no way that we could keep up with the energy demands of that. So those thin walls of the alveoli and the capillaries allow for this process to happen, not require energy, and ultimately allows us to be able to function and be as efficient as we are. So if you move on to the second slide talks about non-respiratory air movements. So these are things that happen within the human body for a variety of reasons. You do have air movement that's going on, but it's not driving at the actual process of respiration. So even though you're moving air, the goal of these functions is not to get oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. It is aimed at something different. So when we look at the different ways or the different parts of non-respiratory air movement, the first one that's listed on there talks about coughing and sneezing. So these are going to take place when you have inhaled or pulled something into your respiratory tract that is not supposed to be there. And the body is going to work to get that material out. Most of your respiratory tract is lined with cilia, tiny little hairs, and when you have dust particles or pollen or anything else rub up against those cilia, it's detected and the body is going to react to that. They don't want that to continue to make its way into your respiratory system and ultimately down to the lungs. So it's going to reverse it and kick it back out. So coughing and sneezing are both going to be reactions that you have to that cilia detecting something in your system. It's not supposed to be there. And then you trying to get it back out of your system. The other one that we have is laughing. So laughing again, obviously we're moving air in and out, but it's not at that goal of gas exchange, getting oxygen in for the purpose of making ATP or getting that carbon dioxide out. Crying is also another way that we tend to move more air than we typically would, but not driving at respiration. And then the last two that we have on there with the yawn and the hiccup. Looking at the yawn is something that seems to fascinate people, and why when one person yawns, that seems to trigger it for another person, and people always want to know why that happens. There are tons of theories out there as to why yawns are contagious, so to speak, but there is really nothing that has ever been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. One of the front running theories is that the oxygen level that we have right now is not where the oxygen level has always been. Oxygen levels used to be much lower, and because of that, there were, as part of that process, with oxygen levels being different, um, you could ultimately be in a place where there wasn't enough oxygen. And so the yawn was a way people thought that the body was naturally reacting to those lower levels of oxygen and then trying to get more air in to increase the oxygen that was in the body. And then the brain detecting that the person next to you is yawning in response to those lower oxygen levels was just kind of like a survival mode for everybody else around to yawn as well. Again, it's a theory. Nothing has ever been proven on that. But the yawn is kind of still an unknown. The last one that you have on there is the hiccup. And the hiccup is usually a response to irritation to the diaphragm muscle. Diaphragm muscle is the one that runs from side to side, front to back, divides the body into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. It sits right underneath the lungs and it plays a very important role in the process of breathing. So, also tucked right underneath the diaphragm is going to be the stomach. So it's not uncommon if you eat something that doesn't necessarily sit well with you, or just with your stomach going through the process of digestion, because of where it sits right underneath the diaphragm, that constant movement of the stomach could potentially irritate that diaphragm and cause it to spasm. When the diaphragm spasms, it's a very quick contraction. And because of its connection to the lungs, when it contracts, it actually pulls your lung open. When the lung opens up, air has to rush in to fill that open space. And so, with that rapid contraction, it opens up very quickly. Air has to come in just as quickly. And you see that result as a hiccup. And the more violent the contraction of the diaphragm is going to dictate how violent the hiccup is. So sometimes you just get small little hiccups, and other times they can be very strong and very painful. And that's all determined by how quickly that diaphragm muscle is contracting. The next series of slides go over the respiratory volumes and capacities. And in looking at the respiratory volumes and capacities, what we're really talking about is, number one, the amount of air that is moved in and out of the lungs as you carry out different um, methods of respiration, and then also how much air is being contained or held in the lung as you go through those different methods of breathing. So when you look at respiratory volumes and capacities, they do vary from one person to the next, just because you have a lot of different factors that are going to be pulled into this. So if you look at the list there, it talks about a person's size. And if you think about a 5-year-old compared to a 15-year-old compared to a 45-year-old, you know that there is growth and development that's happening as you move from one age to the next. And your internal organs are going to be part of that. As you grow and develop, so do your internal structures. So it would make sense that a 5-year-old is not going to have the lung capacity of someone who's 15 or someone who is 45. Gender will also play a role in your respiratory volumes. And you can have two people that are the same height, but the size of their torso from their waist up could be different. And so when you look at that, because that's where the lungs are housed, if you have a larger torso or a longer torso in one person, um, potential for those internal organs to be larger in size also is there. So when you look at those differences in genders, men tend to have a longer torso than females. That would also account for a difference in the respiratory volumes. Age will play a factor in this. And if you think about our conversation the other night, we talked about things that you're just exposed to. Some people live in polluted areas, and that is going to do damage to their lungs. Some people smoke, and if you've been a smoker for 40 years, that's going to do damage to your lungs. And so, in turn, that is also going to play a part in the respiratory volumes. If you have a bunch of alveoli that are broken and damaged, they're not going to be able to exchange the gas in and out. And so that would affect your lung capacity. And then physical condition, which if you have somebody who is not very active and they don't really do any physical activity or not any more physical activity than they absolutely have to, and then you compare that to somebody who is very active, obviously when you work out, you're also going to condition your lungs and you can change and improve your lung capacity based on that physical activity. If you think of swimmers, because of the type of physical activity that they do day in and day out, they're going to have much better lung capacity than your average person who doesn't swim that often would have. The last point on there talks about residual volume. And residual volume just simply speaks to the amount of air that you are always going to have in your lungs. So even if you exhale and you feel like you have exhaled absolutely everything that you are still going to have a certain amount of air in your lungs, and that is called your residual volume. So only 2 times in your entire life that you will not have residual volume in your lungs, and that is prior to being born and after you are no longer with us. Anytime in between, you are going to have about 1,200 milliliters of air in your lungs at any given time. So the next slide, if you take a look at that, it talks about 2 of your lung volumes. And the first one is inspiratory reserve, and the other one is expiratory reserve. So the first one, inspiratory, that goes along with inhale, and it looks at the amount of air that you can pull into your body above what we call your tidal volume. So tidal volume, and I gave you guys a handout the other day, and I liked the reason that I gave you that handout was because I liked the chart on there better than some of the other ones that I had seen. So if you have that handy, I would go ahead and pull that out and kind of take a look at it. But tidal volume is the amount of air that you move in a normal breath. So if you think about one whole cycle, one inhale, one exhale, normal breathing. You are not controlling it, you're not changing anything about it, but just one normal inhale, one normal exhale, all put together. That amount of air movement is your tidal volume. So when we look at the inspiratory reserve volume, what that is actually talking about is the amount of air that you could pull in on top of your tidal volume. So if you are just sitting there right now and you inhale, just a normal inhale, when you get to the top of your inhale and you would normally allow yourself to go back and start exhaling, you hold it at that point and then start inhaling until you cannot inhale anymore. You have pulled in as much air as you possibly can. That additional amount of air that you just inhaled would be your inspiratory reserve volume. On the other side of that, you have the expiratory reserve volume. And this is the amount of air that you could push out after your normal exhale. So again, you're breathing normally, you get to the exhale part of your breath, and then you're breathing, and then you feel like you're going to start to return to an inhale. You hold it there, and now you continue to exhale until you have pushed out everything that you possibly can. All of that air from your normal exhale until you can't exhale anymore would be the expiratory reserve volume. If you've ever been underwater, so you hold your breath and you jump in the water and then you're trying to stay under as long as you can, and that air that you push out to stay under as long as you can, again, just another example of what your expiratory reserve volume is. The next slide goes back to residual volume. We already touched on this. This is the amount of air that you will always have in your lungs. Even after the most forceful expiration or exhale that you possibly can give, you are still going to have air in your lungs, and we call that your residual volume. Next one talks about the vital capacity, and the vital capacity is going to be the total amount of air that you can move. So if you look at this, it says that your vital capacity is equal to the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve plus your expiratory reserve. So if you exhale until you cannot exhale anymore, when you get to that point and then you start to inhale and you inhale all the air you possibly can until you cannot inhale any more air, all of that put together is going to be your vital capacity. So it's your normal breath, everything that you can exhale, as well as everything that you can inhale on top of a normal breath. The next slide that you have talks about the functional volume. And this is going to, if you go to your, again, that chart that I gave you, I'm hoping that you guys have that with you so that you can take a look at it. But the functional volume is just that air that you are able to utilize within a normal breath. So it talks about it being 350 milliliters. I know that that really doesn't mean much, especially when you're talking about air movement. It's hard to imagine what 350 milliliters would be within your, it's just hard to imagine 350 milliliters of air. I realize that. But if you look at that chart, it shows you what your functional volume looks like on the side, and you can just kind of gauge and see what that is off of that chart. The other thing that I wanted to touch on was it talks about these spirometers. And this was a lab that I wanted to do. It's a little measuring device, it's handheld, and it's got a piece that sticks off of it that you would put a mouthpiece over, and then you would blow into it. And here, where it talks about 350 milliliters, this would actually measure it for you, and it would give you a readout of how much air volume you were actually moving so that you could measure some of these. You could measure your inspiratory reserve volume, you could measure your expiratory reserve volume and compare that to the other people in the class. The problem is I only have 4 of them, and because of the design, even though you would get your own mouthpiece, just breathing into that same apparatus, um, not a good point in time to do that. So I'm bummed that we don't get to do this lab because it ties in very well to these lung volumes and being able to actually measure what your personal lung volumes would be. But for obvious reasons, I am going to pull and leave that one out for right now. The next slide that you have talks about internal respiration. And with internal respiration, people just assume as soon as they pull air into their body that it's internal, and that's not the case. So when we talk about internal and external respiration, external respiration is the air that is in your nose, your mouth, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli. So any of those structures from your nose and your mouth to the alveoli, everything in between that, as air is in any of those parts, it's considered to be external. And that's somewhat of a hard concept for some people to kind of wrap their heads around, because they consider if it's in their body that it should be internal. It is not considered to be internal respiration until it makes that cross over that cell membrane. So when it goes from the alveoli and it crosses over and makes it into your bloodstream, once it is in your bloodstream, that is considered to be internal respiration. So until that has happened, it is considered to be external. If you look at the next slide that you have, this is kind of a visual, and I realize there's a lot going on. They've got a bunch of elements and molecules that are all kind of dictated and shown there, and that's not what I want you to really focus on with this. I want you to look at the left-hand picture, and you see the alveoli, and it shows the oxygen being held in the alveoli, and it also shows the carbon dioxide and that exchange happening. So you can see your capillary right next to the alveoli, and alveoli is going to have that oxygen that you just inhaled. It's going to move from the alveoli over to the bloodstream, and likewise the carbon dioxide that is in your bloodstream is going to be released back to the alveoli. So when you exhale, you force that out and remove it from your system. Now, we talked about the process of diffusion when this takes place. The other piece of diffusion is the fact that it's things moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So that's what allows diffusion to happen and not need energy, because the natural way that molecules want to move is from an area where there's a lot of them to an area where there's not as many of them. So when we think about this process and this picture, when you guys inhale, you pull that air in, there's a lot of oxygen in that air that you just pulled into your body. If you think about the bloodstream, your red blood cells carry the oxygen to your cells. And so as they travel through the body, they are constantly dropping off the oxygen that they're carrying to your cells. So by the time your blood gets back to your lungs, it's dropped off a lot of the oxygen that it was carrying. So alveoli, you've inhaled a lot of oxygen hanging out in your alveoli. The blood has been distributing its oxygen, so it's very low in its oxygen content. So that is what allows for that exchange to happen and the oxygen to move from the alveoli to the bloodstream, because they're highly concentrated in the alveoli, because you just pulled all of that good air in, and they are in low concentration in the blood because it just got done dropping off all of it, or not all, but a lot of its oxygen to your cells. On the flip side of that, as your blood is circulating through the body, it's collecting all the CO2 that has been built up in your cells. So it's picking up all this waste product as it's moving through the body. So by the time your blood gets back to your lungs, it's collected all of this carbon dioxide. When you breathe in, the air that you pull into your body actually has very little carbon dioxide in it. The air that we breathe in naturally has less than 1% carbon dioxide content. So now we have a little bit different situation. You've inhaled that air, it's hanging out in the alveoli, but air actually has very little CO2. So in the alveoli, the concentration of CO2 is very low. In our bloodstream, because those red blood cells were collecting all of that carbon dioxide as it traveled through your body, there's actually a high content of carbon dioxide in your bloodstream. So here, through the process of diffusion, things wanting to go from an area of where they're highly concentrated to an area where they're low concentration, we see the reverse movement. Now that carbon dioxide, highly concentrated in the bloodstream, wants to diffuse to an area where it's low concentration, which is back in the alveoli. So the carbon dioxide moves that direction. Now with that carbon dioxide in your alveoli, the next time that you exhale, that carbon dioxide is forced out of the body and it's removed from your system before it's allowed to react with water and turn into carbonic acid. If you move to, I'm going to skip over the neural regulation of respiration for right now. If you move over to the factors that are going to impact your respiratory rate, so obviously physical factors are going to play a role in that. You have the increased body temperature. So as your body temperature elevates, that is going to impact your respiration, as your body is trying to decrease that body temperature and get it back to that 98.6 range. Exercise is going to play another big role in that. With exercise, as you guys are putting your body through physical work, one of the things that happens as you do physical activity is you burn ATP, so that fuel source. So as you're burning that ATP, the body recognizes that and it says that it realizes that it needs to start making more ATP to replenish what you are using. So in order to make ATP, we talked about this very briefly in class, you have to have oxygen. That is why you see your respiratory rate increase when you exercise. You're burning your stockpiles of ATP. Body says we need to start making more ATP. How are we going to get that done? Well, we need more oxygen to make more ATP. So the respiratory rate will increase to get that oxygen in so that you can replace your ATP. Talking will also impact your respiratory rate. especially when you're talking with a mask on. I have noticed that trying to talk through that mask and project more definitely changes my breathing as well. You guys might have noticed that through these last few months as you've been having to also talk through a mask. Coughing is going to change that. Again, as you are forcing that air out, the body is going to pick up on that change in the amount of air in your system and regulate that to get it back to where it needs to be. Emotional factors, that's talking about hyperventilating. And a lot of your breathing rate is going to be dependent on your carbon dioxide levels. That's what plays a role in your body changing how fast you inhale and exhale. So when you start to hyperventilate, it throws off that carbon dioxide levels, and that's why you'll see a change in how people inhale, exhale, is because their body's reaction or response to that. I know there's a couple other slides that are on there. I want you to drop down to the last one, which talks about respiratory rates throughout life changes. So because of the role that the diaphragm plays in your breathing, when we talk about newborns, it's important to recognize the fact that the diaphragm muscle is a skeletal muscle. It needs to be controlled. And so with that control, it's very much like when you have a newborn and somebody hands you the newborn and they always will tell you, make sure to support the head because the neck muscles are not developed. They are not strong enough to hold up the baby's head on its own. So you have to do that for it. Likewise, with the diaphragm muscle, it's not strong enough to regulate the process of breathing the way that it needs to throughout the entire lifetime. And so, if you've ever been around a newborn, some people describe it as they're hyperventilating almost, or that's what it looks like, because their respirations are very shallow and very quick. And that's just because that diaphragm muscle needs a chance to gain strength so it can regulate the process of breathing. So in newborns, you'll see that be somewhere around 80 respirations per minute. As they start to grow and develop and that diaphragm muscle gets stronger, it will drop down to 30. And then as they continue to grow and develop, it will continue to drop down until you get into your adult age, which usually this says 12 to 18, 12 to 15 is going to be your average for an adult. So going back to that diaphragm muscle very quickly, I've mentioned that it's connected to your lungs, and just want to talk for a second on that diaphragm muscle because of how it's connected to the lungs. When the diaphragm muscle contracts, I already mentioned that it's going to pull on the bottom of the lung and it causes the lung to open up. Now, you guys in your everyday life, people feel like they are pulling in air and they're pushing the air out. In actuality, the act of breathing is dependent on pressure and maintaining the same internal and external pressure. So you guys have atmospheric pressure that is pushing down on your body all the time, every day, all day. And you don't even realize that your body is pushing back with the same amount of force. So whatever the atmosphere pushes down with, your body comes back with. That's kept in balance. And so you guys don't notice anything. What happens is when that balance is not maintained, so if the atmosphere was to push down on your body with more force than what you could push back with, you would implode. Or if your body pushes out with more than what the atmosphere is coming down with, then you would explode. So maintaining that pressure is a very fine balance, but it's actually what's happening when you guys inhale and exhale. So when that diaphragm muscle contracts and pulls that lung open, that changes the pressure inside your body. And there has to be some sort of response so that the internal and external pressures can be maintained. So what happens is the lung opens up, and in order to maintain that pressure balance, air rushes in to fill that space, maintains internal external pressure. When the diaphragm muscle relaxes, now it's going to cause that lung to kind of collapse back down. And when it collapses, that is going to force the air out. So actually, when you see the active breathing of inhaling and exhaling, it is your body's way of maintaining internal and external pressure to make sure that that is always kept in balance. So that ends the lecture part. Couple of things. You do have your test next time that we meet. And so with that, I'm going to post in Blackboard a list of those things where you should really put your focus in order to get ready for that test. There is going to be a short assignment as well. And I don't even know it's really an assignment as much as it is kind of a study tool in getting ready for the test. So it is going to align with um, what I'm putting out there as far as the study guide, just to give you some extra practice moving forward. So make sure that you take a look at Blackboard, look at that study guide, and then work through those questions that I have as well. Just like I said, to help get ready for the test. If you have any questions between now and our next class, please send me an email and I will answer those for you.